Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're traveling back to ancient Egypt, but not for pyramids or pharaohs. No, tonight's topic is far more mundane, far more you probably wouldn't survive this levels of tedious. How the ancient Egyptians organized their sock drawers. Picture this. You wake up in a mud brick house along the Nile, the sun already baking the air, and the first thought in your head isn't, how do I avoid crocodiles today? But, where did I put my good linen socks? Because yes, socks existed, though calling them socks might be generous. More like foot wraps, really. But they were organized, and organization in a world without IKEA storage bins is its own kind of miracle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are, for the sake of this story, a linen weaver in the city of Thebes. Not a fancy one, not the kind who makes robes for priests or pharaohs. No, you're the guy who makes the socks, the foot wrappings, the things people forget about until they step on a scorching stone path and realize, oh right, I should have worn something between my toes and the blistering earth. Your day starts before dawn because, in Egypt, everything starts before dawn if you want to avoid melting into the sand. You shuffle to your storage nook, a small alcove in your home where you keep your personal stash of foot wraps. This is where the first great sock dilemma of history begins. Linen or leather? Linen is the classic choice. Light, breathable, perfect for a climate where the air feels like a damp oven. But leather? Leather is for people who mean business. Soldiers, caravan traders, anyone who plans on walking farther than the nearest beer stand. You, however, are a simple sock weaver. You go with linen. Historians still argue whether Egyptians actually preferred linen socks or if leather was just too expensive for daily use. But here's a fringe tidbit. Some mummies have been found with both materials, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, ancient Egyptians had a work sock and a nice sock division. Groundbreaking. As you wrap your feet, you notice something tragic. One of your socks has a faint orange stain. Again, this is the curse of desert dyes. Sometimes the colors just... The linen versus leather sock debate isn't just about comfort. It's a cultural battleground. As you finish wrapping your feet, you glance at your neighbor's door across the dusty alley. Hasu the sandal maker, of course, swears by leather foot wraps. Linen is for priests and children. He sneered at you just last week. Meanwhile, your other neighbor, Tarit the baker, insists linen is the only civilized choice. Leather makes your feet smell like a dead hippo, she likes to say. You stay out of it. Sock politics are dangerous. Mainstream history tells us linen dominated everyday life in Egypt. It was lightweight, easy to wash, and kept you cool. But here's the quirky twist. Some leather socks have been found with tiny ventilation holes punched into them, suggesting a desperate attempt to make them breathable. Imagine the trial and error. What if I poke more holes? Now it's just a sandal. Historians still argue whether these were fashion statements or failed experiments. One fringe theory even claims certain leather socks were ritual items, worn only during ceremonies dedicated to Anubis, the jackal-headed god, because, well, dogs chew on leather. Makes sense. You step outside, and the heat slaps you like a warm loaf of bread. Time for work. As you walk, you notice a sock-related crisis unfolding near the market. A merchant is yelling at a scribe, waving what looks like a single leather sock. This was a pair when I gave it to you for inventory. The scribe, looking exhausted, replies, the records say otherwise. This is why you stick to linen. Fewer scandals. You arrive at your weaving station just as the morning breeze, if you can call it that, kicks up a lazy swirl of dust. Today's task, repairing a batch of temple socks. Not the fancy ones with gold threads, those are handled by the senior weavers, but the worker socks, the ones worn by the guys hauling limestone blocks under the sun. These socks have seen things. Mainstream history loves to talk about pyramid construction, but nobody mentions the real hero, the sock. Without proper foot wraps, workers would have been sliding around like drunken ibises. And here's a quirky fact. Some socks had palm fiber grips woven into the soles, essentially the world's first non-slip work footwear. OSHA would have been proud. Historians still argue whether these grips were intentional or just happy accidents from lazy weaving. One papyrus fragment even mentions a worker complaining that his socks were too grippy, leaving him stuck to a ramp mid-pyramid. As you stitch, you overhear two laborers debating sock length. "Ankle coverage is for the weak," one scoffs. The other retorts, "Tell that to my scarab bite." You sigh. Some debates never die. The noon sun turns your workspace into a bread oven, which reminds you of yesterday's sock-related bakery incident. Tarit had tried using an old sock as a pot holder, resulting in what she called linen-flavored flatbread. Never again. Today's challenge: organizing the temple's seasonal sock rotation. Summer socks, thinner, often bleached white, get stored in clay jars with cedar shavings to deter moths. Winter socks, yes, Egypt had chilly nights, are packed with wool linings. Here's a mainstream fact: Egyptians were masterful at textile storage, using everything from natron salt to honey as preservatives. But the fringe detail? Some jars contain scented socks infused with myrrh, likely for high-status individuals who wanted to walk around smelling like a god's armpit. Historians still argue whether these were prestige items or early attempts at foot deodorant. One mummy's socks reportedly still carried a faint cinnamon scent after 3,000 years. Now that's staying power. As you label jars, a junior priest rushes in. "We need emergency socks for the sacred baboon." Apparently, the temple's primate has developed a blister. You didn't sign up. The commotion near the temple gates is impossible to ignore. A royal messenger stands dripping Nile water onto the stones, clutching a papyrus scroll in one hand and, you squint, a single gold-threaded sock in the other. "By order of Pharaoh's fourth sock overseer," he announces breathlessly, "all households must submit their sock counts by next moon." You sigh. It's that time again, the Great Sock Census. Mainstream history records these censuses as vital for textile taxation. But what the carvings don't show are the nights spent unraveling old socks to hit quota. If I separate the threads, does this count as 2 socks? The current system was implemented after the Great Sock Famine of 1321 BCE, when half of Memphis allegedly went barefoot because a scribe misplaced a decimal point. Here's the quirky bit. Some clever souls tried registering fish nets as water socks. It worked exactly once. Historians still argue whether these counts were truly about socks or covert population tracking. A fragmentary ostrakhan suggests some neighborhoods hid their best socks when census takers came, like ancient Egyptians' version of stashing the good silver. As you begin counting your inventory, your cat Batet bats a ball of linen yarn into your ledger. You accept this divine intervention and call it a night. The morning brings an unexpected challenge. A delegation of Nubian traders has arrived with a mysterious new fiber they claim is sockworthy. You run the strange material between your fingers. It's softer than linen but somehow cooler to the touch. The lead trader grins. "Grown in the shadow of the southern mountains," he boasts. "Never fades, never tears, repels scorpions." You raise an eyebrow at that last claim. Mainstream history confirms extensive trade in exotic textiles, but what they don't mention is the great sock fiber debate of Amenhotep III's reign. Court records show heated arguments between traditional linen loyalists and new fiber advocates that apparently required royal intervention. Here's the fascinating fringe detail. Archaeologists recently found a cache of experimental socks near Aswan featuring what appears to be woven lotus fibers mixed with spider silk. The kicker? They're still flexible after 3,400 years. Historians still argue whether these innovations were driven by fashion or function. One theory suggests the see-through lotus socks were ceremonial, while another maintains they were early attempts at breathable athletic wear for chariot racers. As you test the Nubian fabric, Hasu the sandal maker peers over your shoulder. "Looks like you're weaving clouds," he mutters, suddenly defensive about his leather wares. You smile and keep weaving, wondering if this might be your ticket out of the Sockweavers Guild. Disaster strikes at midday. A gust of wind scatters your carefully organized sock inventory across the marketplace. You watch in horror as your finest work, including a pair of ceremonial socks meant for the high priest of Ta goes tumbling past vegetable stalls and into the path of a particularly curious goat. Mainstream history focuses on grand temple rituals, but never mentions the frantic sock retrieval ceremonies that must have occurred behind the scenes. There's actually a wall painting in a lesser-known tomb showing servants chasing wayward linens with nets, though most Egyptologists dismiss it as symbolic. Here's a quirky survival tip. Many weavers sewed tiny lead weights into sock hems after the Great Wind of 1275 BCE. Not very comfortable, but excellent for keeping your inventory grounded. Some particularly paranoid souls even attached fishing lines to their waists like ancient retractable sock leashes. Historians still argue whether these measures were common or just the ancient equivalent of that one weird coworker. A recently translated complaint tablet mentions a weaver who allegedly trained monkeys to retrieve socks, though the results were mixed. As you rescue the high priest's socks from the goat's jaws, only slightly chewed, you make a mental note to start using those lead weights tomorrow, maybe 2 per sock. The afternoon brings an unusual request. A naval officer needs socks that can withstand weeks at sea. Regular linen dissolves like papyrus in broth after 10 days of waves, he complains. You ponder this while watching a trio of ducks paddle by in the canal. Mainstream history documents Egypt's river navy extensively, but never addresses the critical sock shortage that apparently plagued sailors. Ship logs found at Wadi al-Jarf contain repeated requests for sturdier foot garments, between reports of rations and repairs. Here's an odd maritime fact. Some sailors wore fish skin over socks treated with resin. They smelled terrible but reportedly lasted months. The most successful version used Nile perch skin, which conveniently came pre-sized small, medium, and whoa, that's a big fish. Historians still argue whether these were practical solutions or acts of desperation. One papyrus fragment describes a sailor who wove his own socks from shredded fishing nets and palm fibers, creating what might have been history's first waterproof sandal sock hybrid. As you experiment with tighter weaves and double-stitched toes, the officer eyes your progress skeptically. Just make sure they float, he mutters. You nod solemnly, already imagining the advertisement. Pharaoh's Navy-approved socks will not disintegrate before your enemies do. A rumor spreads through the weaving quarter. The pharaoh's youngest daughter has declared socks unfashionable. Courtiers panic. Suddenly, your workshop is flooded with nobles demanding their sock orders be undone. Unweave them, one wails, as if you can simply erase hours of labor. Mainstream history records royal fashion decrees, but none mention the Great Sock Rebellion of 1213 BCE, when sandal makers briefly overtook sock weavers in social status. Tomb paintings from the period suspiciously show fewer foot coverings, likely artistic compliance rather than reality. Here's the quirky twist. Some desperate weavers began marketing socks as invisible. Only the truly refined can see them. Shockingly, it worked. A receipt found in Thebes lists payment for 1 pair of finest air socks, lightly scented with lotus. Historians still argue whether this was mass delusion or ancient marketing genius. One theory suggests the invisible sock trend was a covert way to keep the sock trade alive during anti-sock regimes. As you reluctantly unravel a half-finished pair, your apprentice whispers, "What if we bedazzle them?" You pause. Gold thread would make them look more royal. The next morning brings an unexpected visitor, a harried scribe from the Temple of Thoth. "We need silent socks," he insists. The new oracles claim footstep noises disrupt divine visions. You blink. Silent socks? Mainstream history confirms temples had strict noise ordinances, but none mention acoustically optimized footwear. However, a cache of moonlight linen was recently discovered, an ultrafine we've allegedly blessed by Hathor herself for quiet movement. Here's the weird part. Some priests lined their socks with bat fur for sound absorption. It worked, albeit at the cost of making the temple floors look like they were molting. Historians still argue whether this was pious innovation or priestly nonsense. One medical papyrus even warns against overly quiet socks, claiming they could trick the wearer into thinking they died. You experiment with padded reed fibers, but your cat Bastet's judgmental stare says it all. Finally, you land on a solution. Thicker soles, looser weave. The scribe tests them, takes 2 steps, and gasps, "I can't hear myself at all." You nod solemnly. "That'll be 5 Deben." A sandstorm rolls in, coating everything in grit, including your entire sock inventory. As you shake out a particularly stubborn pair, you realize, this is why Egyptians perfected laundry. Mainstream history glosses over ancient cleaning methods, but laundry was serious business. The Hennet, professional washer, charged extra for socks, since they required 2 rounds of pounding against stones. Some particularly fussy clients demanded Nile water only from certain bends of the river. Here's a bizarre fact. Wealthier households used ground ostrich eggshells as a scrubbing agent. The results? Gleaming whites and socks that could probably stop arrows. Historians still argue whether laundry was women's work or a gender-neutral grind. One tomb relief shows male and female laundry teams working side by side, while a satirical papyrus depicts a god doing his own washing and shrinking all his linens. As you beat the dust from your socks, Hasu yells across the alley, "Leather doesn't have this problem." You ignore him. Tomorrow you're inventing clotheslines. A child tugs at your sleeve. "Can you make socks for my doll?" she asks. You pause. "Doll socks? This might be your most challenging commission yet." Mainstream history documents countless toys, but none address the critical issue of scale footwear. However, a dig at Akhenaten uncovered a dollhouse-sized basket containing what appear to be miniature sock prototypes, some with decorative toe loops. Here's the adorable twist. Some doll socks had hieroglyphic messages woven in, like, "Walk in Marat," or, "Don't tell mother I stayed up late." Historians still argue whether these were practice pieces for young weavers or serious luxury items. One wealthy tomb contained a doll with lapis lazuli beads sewn into its socks. Ancient Egyptian bling for the under 10 crowd. As you craft tiny linen wraps, the girl watches, mesmerized. "Now she won't get blisters building pretend pyramids," she declares. You smile. Maybe sock making is a noble calling. The annual festival of unpaired socks arrives. In the marketplace, a somber procession carries a ceremonial basket of lone socks while mourners wail. You contribute a particularly nice blue one that's been missing its match since flood season. Mainstream history ignores this quirky tradition, but temple records list offerings to Tatenin, earth god of lost items. The most valuable single sock ever sacrificed? A gold-toed specimen belonging to Queen Tai herself. Here's the funny part. Some crafty souls ran sock orphanages, where people could swap strays. The system worked until someone realized most orphans were just stolen goods being recycled. Historians still argue whether this was true religious observance or an excuse to drink before noon. A recovered priest's journal notes, "Year 22 of Ramses. Still no divine revelation about where socks go." As the ceremony ends, you spot your missing sock's twin on a merchant's foot. You say nothing. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. A royal decree bans striped socks. Apparently they're disruptive to cosmic harmony. You stare at your half-finished striped pair. Now what? Mainstream history records plenty of arbitrary sumptuary laws, but none so specific as Sock Decree 419. The punishment? Forced wear of mismatched colors for a lunar cycle, a fate worse than death for fashion-conscious scribes. Here's the creative loophole. Weavers invented subtle texture variations that looked solid from afar but up close whispered rebellion. Some even wove secret symbols into the weave, an early form of sock-based dissent. Historians still argue whether this law targeted actual socks or was code for something else. One radical theory suggests striped socks was slang for corrupt tax collectors. As you unravel your stripes, your apprentice suggests polka dots. You consider it. The decree did say nothing about dots. A merchant from Punt arrives with scented socks that allegedly never need washing. The aroma, somewhere between myrrh and fermented figs, lingers for hours after he leaves. Mainstream history documents extensive trade with Punt, but none mention their legendary self-cleaning textiles. Modern tests suggest they were treated with citrus and salt compounds and early antimicrobial tech. Here's the catch: the scent attracted bees. Several palace guards reportedly got stung through their Fresh Forever socks. Historians still argue whether these were practical or purely status items. One medical text warns against over-perfumed feet, claiming it could confuse one's ka during sleep. As you examine a sample, your nose wrinkles. Never need washing might just mean too smelly to notice dirt. You stick with linen. A military recruiter examines your socks critically. Could these stop a scorpion sting? He asks. You hesitate. Would you like them to try? Mainstream history details army logistics but ignores the critical sock specifications for desert campaigns. Recent finds at frontier forts reveal triple-layered socks in Barak ruins, likely the ancient equivalent of Kevlar. Here's the battlefield hack. Some soldiers lined socks with flattened crocodile scales. Surprisingly effective, though lacing them took forever. Historians still argue whether these were standard issue or desperate improvisations. A letter from a frontier soldier complains, the scales keep clicking when I sneak up on people. As you reinforce a pair with extra weaving, the recruiter nods approvingly. Just don't tell the quartermaster what they cost. A priest requests socks woven during a lunar eclipse for enhanced mystical properties. You sigh. Special orders always mean overtime. Mainstream history records celestial events meticulously, but none mention eclipse textiles. However, the Book of the Dead does warn against wearing incorrectly timed linens in the afterlife. Here's the mystical markup. Eclipse socks cost triple, allegedly because the weaver had to chant while working. Most just worked normal shifts and lied. Historians still argue whether this was real belief or priestly profiteering. One angry letter to a vizier complains about so-called eclipse socks that faded just like regular ones. As you squint at the moon that night, your apprentice asks, what if we just say we started at eclipse time? You shake your head. The gods keep receipts. A frantic noble bursts in, I need sock puppets for my child's birthday. You stare. This isn't what you trained for. Mainstream history preserves many toys, but sock puppets leave little archaeological trace. However, a tomb painting shows a child holding what might be a linen animal on one hand, possibly history's first Mr. Sock Cobra. Here's the creative part. Wealthy families added beaded eyes and dyed fringe for hair. Some even had tiny hieroglyphic jokes woven in. This puppet taxes your snacks. Historians still argue whether these were mere toys or early educational tools. One theory suggests puppet shows taught morality tales like the sock who forgot to do its laundry. As you stitch on felt ears, the noble claps. Now make it roar like a lion. You clear your throat. This wasn't in the guild contract. A drought hits and suddenly everyone wants socks that conserve sweat. You didn't know that was a thing. Mainstream history tracks Nile floods but ignores the textile adaptations to drought. However, medical papyri mention foot powders to absorb moisture, early odor control. Here's the weird science. Some weavers mixed pulverized sandstone into the weave for absorption. Effective if slightly gritty. Historians still argue whether this was hygiene or superstition. One fragmentary text claims wearing thirsty socks could appease the river god. As you experiment with absorbent reeds, your apprentice sniffs the result. Smells like a wet goat. Back to the drawing board. A scandal erupts when a merchant is caught selling pharaoh-quality socks that are just regular socks with gold paint. The punishment? He must wear his own fakes for a month. Mainstream history documents trade regulations but misses the drama of textile fraud. Court records show this happens surprisingly often, with one repeat offender finally banished to the land of no socks. Here's the shady part. Some counterfeiters used onion skin dye to mimic premium hues. The smell gave them away every time. Historians still argue whether enforcement was about consumer protection or protecting elite monopolies. A vizier's memo complains that fake socks confuse the social order. As you examine your own gold thread supply, you make a note, always keep receipts. A funeral director requests see-through socks for mummies so the afterlife gatekeepers can inspect their toes. You didn't realize the afterlife had footwear inspections. Mainstream history documents burial practices extensively, but none mention post-mortem sock requirements. However, some mummies were buried with multiple sock layers, possibly for changing in the do-it. Here's the eerie detail. A few elite socks had toe outlines embroidered on them, like X-rays for the underworld. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or literal belief. One funerary text warns that improper socks make the soul trip in the field of reeds. As you weave the sheer linen, Badet bats at the nearly invisible threads. You hope Anubis appreciates your craftsmanship. A kitchen worker brings you a sock-shaped loaf of bread. For inspiration, she says. It's oddly flattering. Mainstream history records bakeries but ignores their textile-themed experiments. However, tomb offerings sometimes included linen-wrapped bread, possibly the world's first sock and sandal combo meal. Here's the delicious twist. Some bakers used sock molds to create foot-shaped pastries for festivals. Hieroglyphs call them walking cakes. Historians still argue whether this was culinary art or practical joke. One satirical papyrus shows a god choking on a too realistic toe bun. As you nibble the sock bread, Tarit yells from next door, "Stop eating your inspiration." Too late. A scribe presents a sock tax proposal so convoluted it makes your head spin. Socks with stripes pay 3 deben, socks with fringe pay 5. Mainstream history documents ancient taxes but rarely mentions textile tariffs. However, a ledger from Deir el-Medina lists sock taxes paid in garlic, apparently acceptable currency. Here's the creative accounting. Some weavers registered socks as foot veils or ankle clouds to avoid higher categories. Historians still argue whether this system was efficient or just bureaucratic madness. One scribe's note complains, "If I have to classify one more artistic foot wrap, I'll throw myself in the Nile." As you calculate your potential dues, you consider retirement. Maybe fishing needs fewer regulations. A visiting diplomat from Mitanni scoffs at your socks. "In my country, we braid our foot coverings." He demonstrates it involves knots you're pretty sure violate several laws of physics. Mainstream history records international relations but misses these textile diplomacy moments. However, a peace treaty with Babylon includes a clause about mutual sock respect. Here's the cultural clash. Egyptian linen purists called braided socks barbarian nets, while foreign traders mocked linen as flimsy sun filters. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were serious or just ancient trash talk. One wall carving shows ambassadors comparing socks like competitive fathers at a school play. As the diplomat struts away in his knotted monstrosities, you whisper, "Enjoy your blisters." A flood damages your sock inventory, leaving everything slightly damp and mysteriously stretchy. You consider marketing them as adaptive fit. Mainstream history tracks Nile floods but ignores the textile aftermath. However, medical texts warn against swamp sock syndrome, a condition where feet melt like wax in poorly dried linens. Here's the salvage strategy. Some weavers rebranded shrunken socks as child size and stretched ones as 4 generous feet. Historians still argue whether flood socks were a bargain or a scam. One complaint tablet reads, "These pharaoh's bargains could fit a hippo." As you wring out another pair, your apprentice asks, "What if we say they're pre-shrunk?" You nod. Business is business. A priestess requests socks woven by left-handed weavers for moon rituals. You glance at your team. This is getting specific. Mainstream history documents temple requisitions but rarely mentions handedness requirements. However, a textile fragment from Dendera bears a left-hand blessing mark, possibly early quality assurance. Here's the mystical logic. Left-handed socks were believed to contain more shadow, whatever that means. They cost double. Historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or just price gouging. One priest's diary confesses, "Couldn't tell left from right socks in the dark anyway." As your left-handed apprentice takes over, you wonder if right-handed socks feel neglected. A rumor spreads, wearing socks inside out invites bad luck. Suddenly, everyone's checking their seams. Mainstream history records many superstitions but none so sock-specific. However, dream interpretation texts warn that reversed socks in dreams predict reversed fortunes. Here's the panic response. Some started wearing double-layered socks, right side out on both sides, just to be safe. Historians still argue whether this was widespread belief or just merchant propaganda to sell more socks. A satirical poem mocks a man who wore 7 pairs at once to cheat the gods. As you demonstrate proper sock alignment to a worried customer, you resist, suggesting sockless might be simpler. A royal edict declares purple socks restricted to nobility. You stare at your last batch of accidentally purplish linens. Damn those unstable dyes. Time for some creative relabeling. Mainstream history documents sumptuary laws but rarely mentions their textile enforcement. However, tomb paintings show inspectors checking hems for illegal colors. Here's the dyer's dilemma. Many purple socks were just faded reds or overcooked blues. The color police weren't always discerning. Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced or just for show. One merchant's ledger lists regrettably noble-colored socks sold discreetly to wealthy commoners. As you dunk your purplish socks in vinegar for cleaning, obviously you consider moving to a less chromatically strict profession. A group of scribes presents a mathematical theory about optimal sock folding. You never knew geometry could be this tedious. Mainstream history preserves Egyptian math but ignores its textile applications. However, the Rind Papyrus includes a problem about dividing socks among priests that's either practical or absurd. Here's the academic twist. Some temples kept folded sock models to train new priests in proper storage angles. Historians still argue whether this was efficiency or obsession. One scribe's marginal note reads, "If I have to calculate one more sock hypotenuse, I'll use it to hang myself." As you demonstrate the delta fold technique, your apprentice falls asleep. Fair enough. The sun sets on another day of sock-related adventures. From the pharaoh's gold-threaded pairs to the fisherman's patched-up foot wraps, each tells a story, even if it's just, "I really didn't want blisters today." Mainstream history will remember wars and monuments, but you've kept Egypt's feet comfortable one stitch at a time. And when future archaeologists find these socks in tombs, they'll puzzle over why so much care went into something so humble. But it's the small things, the quiet craftsmanship, the perfect seam, the sock that just fits, that makes civilization possible. That let people walk far enough to build pyramids or write poems or come home to family at day's end. As the stars emerge, you put away your loom. Somewhere down the Nile, someone's feet are warm. That's legacy enough. Now, dim the lights a little more. Let the Nile's distant murmur lull you. Tomorrow will bring new socks, new challenges, new impossibly specific requests. But tonight is for rest.